And I guess I'd like to thank Chris Dowling for joining us as well from BackPaddock. Chris will throw his 2 bobs worth in from his very vast experience in this area. And we're probably trying to bring a sort of combined understanding of, changing the way we think about fertility from a paddock basis to a zone basis. So I think that's a really important message, is that we've got to stop thinking on a field by field basis and start thinking at a zone or even a sub-zone sort of level. I'll just flip to straight to presentation now so you can see it a bit more clearly. But I guess we're trying to bring simple tools to the market because, in the past, it's just been way too complicated to manage things on a zonal basis. It's just, even just trying to find a yield map in a simple format so that you can view it on your phone in the field is almost impossible. So we've got to change the way we're delivering data to farmers and agronomists. And I guess our mantra is all about bringing simple tools to the market to enable you to do that. I guess why are we here? Everyone knows that, urea price is going through the roof as is everything else. And we're probably facing some supply shortages. This is the urea price in the last 10 years in Australian dollars. We've seen a fair old kick up in the last little while. So, we certainly are, feeling that pinch. And the great thing is, though, that commodity prices are strong and hopefully balancing out some of these additional costs. The other thing that I guess is happening right now in Australia, as most of you are aware, it's very wet. This is the latest map from the Bureau of Soil Water, root zone soil water. And you can see really clearly that most of the northern growing regions are well and truly well above wet soil in terms of soil moisture. So, if you match nitrogen use, for example, with soil water, they're pretty much a 1-to-1 in the old scale. So, there's a big opportunity here with full profiles to grow big winter crops. I guess the southern areas like South Australia, WA, and into Victoria are relying mostly on in-crop rain anyway. But this looks really good for a big setup for a crop. So we've got big opportunities and full profiles, but also extremely high commodity prices. So what we're going to talk about today, and Chris, you just jump in whenever you feel like it. She's pretty relaxed today, guys, so feel free to ask any questions as we go along. We're going to talk about 3 simple tools today. One is variable rate application based on the crop, on the actual crop that's growing. So using the crop to determine what we do, and that could be, just some examples could be in-crop nitrogen, which is probably the most popular topic, but also things like plant growth regulators. We often see that the biomass is very clearly defined in satellite data, and therefore the application of plant growth regulators in certain high rainfall environments is also a very smart way of using these tools. We've also seen farmers using these satellite data to manage micronutrients. So where there might be particular deficiencies in certain parts of the field, we just apply on those areas, or it might be more product on those areas rather than less. So, there is great opportunity beyond just nitrogen as well. The second thing we're going to talk about is the long-term productivity zones. So we can use satellite data to help us define different soil types and or crop potential. So what has that crop, or pasture potential been like for the last 5 years? And that could point us to things like soil amelioration, so gypsum or lime. And we have a lot of farmers every year using our stack product to derive their gypsum and lime areas. But I think stack is wider than that, it's bigger than that, and I'll show you why in a minute, because it leads really nicely into number 3, which is our Enriched Strips. So using high nitrogen strips to actually determine the responsiveness on the crop in real time, and not just at like an average across the field, but what are the zonal responses to this? So does the amount of nitrogen that you've applied respond differently in the high, medium and low sort of zones of the field, historically? So do you get more responsiveness out of the low or the high zones? And running strips is a very important way of doing that, and we'll get into that in more detail. So without any further questions, we'll start off with just the variable rate using rapid zoning. So this is where you're using the satellite data to determine really where to check in the field. That's the number one thing. This is not about replacing your role as a farmer or agronomist to tell you everything from a satellite. It's certainly not that. It's a really good tool to help you identify those different areas of growth that you may or may not see by eye. The good thing about satellite data is that it picks up beyond our visible spectrum. So you're seeing crop differences that you might not see on the ground. They might be too subtle to see on the ground. And often when you're walking through a field between highs and lows, your eyes generally adjust. Unless you take a photo in a high and a low, it's very hard to discriminate as you're walking through a field. So it's a great tool to actually point you in the right direction. We're then converting that image, which is all little pixels, into what we call zones, so high, medium, and low, for example. And then after your ground truthing, it's really about adding your rates of product, and then that obviously depends on the product that you're trying to apply. And then we're looking at exporting that into the spreader as quickly, as short a time frame and quickly as possible. So most of you are already users on our platform, so you're probably very familiar with this, but I just thought I'd cover it over. If you haven't accessed our satellite data before, then you can just sign up for free. You create a farm and you draw your fields. And once you've drawn your fields or uploaded them, you can upload them from, say, BackPaddock. You can bring them in as a shapefile or a Google KML file. You can bring the boundaries in, so you don't have to redraw them all. And then you can access that data. And basically, it's real time. Every 5 days, there's a satellite image coming over everywhere in the world. And hopefully it's cloud free. And then when it's cloud free, you can get in and have a look at those biomass differences and seeing where's the highs and lows in that field. And we put a bit of magic sauce on it to get it to look like it does, so that we're actually really trying to pull out those differences. We're actually really trying to accentuate those differences for you, so that you're not left wondering. I've seen other software that sort of smooths it all out and you really can't see those differences. So once you're comfortable with that image and you've ground truthed it and understand what's driving that change, you can then click zone, and I'll show you on the next page how to do that. And for 40 cents a hectare, it converts that file or that image into a file that will feed straight into the controller. And I'll go through that in more detail now. So there's the image on the screen that you would normally see on a field, and the zoning button is over on the right-hand side. Now, I will say one thing. This is our current platform. We are due to release a brand new platform shortly, which will have more enhanced tools for zoning. At the moment, it's fairly basic, but that's the idea, is to keep it simple and get 80-20 rule, I guess. Chris, have you got any comments on what you see in images and what it might mean?
Well, the crop's responding to either limitations or availability of water once you're looking in crops. So, or something that's limiting the crop now. Obviously, in any one season, that's influenced by the amount and the way the water falls and the way pests and weeds might be interacting with the crop. So more particularly in a single season, it's important to go and validate than necessarily in a 5-year stack.
That's good. We'll lead into that in a minute, Chris. And I just responded to one of the messages here. Yes, the recording will be made available on YouTube afterwards. So you're talking about short-term and long-term effects. That's really important, because this is picking up here and now, whereas the stack is a long-term trend. I think it's really important, to reiterate the ground truth, Chris, because I've been into fields where this is beautiful, big blue on the biomass image here. You think this is going to be a fantastic crop, and you get in there and it's all ryegrass. So I think it's really important to understand, what you're looking at, and you have to go on ground truth before you make any of those decisions. That's a fair call, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Once we've hit zone there, you can see what we've built is a little tool that instantly converts that into high, medium, and low. And yes, that's not perfect, right? You might want 5 zones, and we'll soon be building a tool that'll do 5 zones. And you might think, well, that low zone there isn't quite related to this low zone. We get that. But this is a really simple entry point tool to add rates down here. And then once you purchase it, that file will come through. So I think it's we're trying to just get simpler tools to enable you to almost do this in the field on your iPad or on your phone if you've got some coverage. I know it's a bit of a challenge. Well, it's a big challenge across most areas, but we've built this too to make it more suitable to go in the field, to locate yourself in the field, and then to push out a variable rate map really quickly. Any other comments on that, Chris?
No, look, I think it's the move from whole to part paddock is a stepwise, and then the next one is to refine it from there. But the main thing is, it's, as you said, it's the 80-20 rule. As long as you've got 80% right, the other 20 will get it right later.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's really important. So one of the questions just come in: how many controllers accept shapefiles? So pretty much every new controller will accept a shapefile. And this is I'll actually step through now how to actually put it into a John Deere and a Trimble screen, but pretty much everything will accept a shapefile. And, even Topcon, all the major manufacturers, anything relatively new will be fine. If you need some help with that, we've got specialists, machinery specialists, to help you actually get that into the right format if it needs modifying. But we've put it into all sorts of weird and wonderful machines, and shapefiles are accepted by almost all new machines now. So that's the good thing. Someone's finally decided that we better accept some kind of standard because industry is full of non-standards. I know this might seem a bit basic for some of you that are au fait with computers, but we get this all the time. Is even just the simple stuff people no one's ever explained it to them. So I'm just going to explain it now really briefly what a shapefile is. So it's a file format that was actually created by Esri, one of the largest GIS programs in the world. So they created this format, which has sort of been pseudo adopted by a lot of industries, and it's something we've been working with for a long time. But the thing about shapefiles is that we send them to you in a zipped format. So we zip all of the files together so that it's easy to email and download. What you'll find when you unzip that, normally in a Windows Explorer, just a right-click extract all, or you might have some other sort of extraction software along the line. But you can just extract, and then when it comes out, it'll come out looking like this. So this particular one is from our platform. It's got 4 different files associated with it. Now, sometimes you might have 6 or 8 files, depending on the complexity of the software that's generating these files. But you need at least those, and you got to make sure that you copy all of those across to the USB stick or pushing up to the controller. Often I'll ask people, can you send me your shapefile, and I'll get the .shp one and not all the others. Well, without all the others, it's useless. It's completely useless. So you need to copy all of those files off when you are sending this to the machine or to someone else to help you with this. Or you send them the zip file and they can unzip it themselves. The thing is that all these controllers too will need the files unzipped. They won't accept them zipped. So you have to unzip those to actually use them in the machine. I hope that is not too basic for a lot of you guys that are probably familiar with this, but I thought I'd just cover it anyway. So something like the Trimble screens, you can just if you actually put a USB stick into your Trimble screen and download some data, any sort of data, it will automatically build this tree inside that USB stick. And you'll notice in there there's a thing called prescriptions. In that there's a folder in there called prescriptions. Well, you can just copy and paste those shape files, all those files together into that prescription folder. And next time you want to bring in a prescription, you just go import, and it'll detect already that you have files in there. So there's a little tip. And also with, say, the 2630s, a lot of people have 2630 John Deeres. You just create an RX folder on your USB stick, and you put those files into that folder, all those files together. And if you've got multiple shape files, then you put them all in there. And you just run through a little wizard, the data transfer wizard, and it'll tell you to, once you've got the data stick in, to import that into the machine. And it'll take you through a little wizard to actually import those. It'll ask you what do you want the rate adjusted at all, and do you what's your default rate. So it will if you are out of outside of the prescription map, it will put the default rate in. Thanks, Bill, for comment there. If you're on File Explorer, you need to enable the View Extension file type. That's very important, yes. So if I go back a couple of slides, you might not see those, what do you call those? Extension? No, it's not extensions. Just the last little bit of each file name. You might not see those. So it's important that you have that function turned on, and that you copy all those files across. Or if you're sending them to someone, make sure you send all of those files across. So once you've gone through that little John Deere wizard, it'll show you this. This is a zone map on our platform, and this is the same zone map inside the screen. And one thing you'll notice if you look carefully, that John Deere in its wisdom, and Trimble does the same thing, it decides to smooth out some of the zones for you just because it feels like it. And it's trying to simplify the polygons a bit. You'll notice in our platform, we've actually done the simplification of the polygons for you, but John Deere and Trimble like to make it more simple because their screens really aren't that capable of handling lots of data. So they simplify it even more. So that's why you might notice a slight change as it brings it in. It's called a Shapefile Converter, and it'll do that in the screen itself. But anyway, like Chris said, 80/20, it's good enough to get started. This is a really sort of rapid way of getting started. Is there any other comments, Chris, at the moment, or?
No, I think that's covered it. It's good.
Another comment was, if you need zip files, you can zip them in and upload to Google Drive, and then you can download it from there. So Google Drive automatically zips it for you. So thanks very much for that comment. And some GIS software wants you to zip it files first, correct? And our program does the same thing. If you're uploading a shapefile, it has to be a zip shapefile because it's bringing all those files in together. Yes, and thank you, Samantha, for explaining these terms in a bit more simple format. No worries. It's important to get these things sorted out. For those that got the luxury of nice big new green machines, we've got a lot of clients that will push these shape files directly through My John Deere. And now that it's freely available for all new machines, as they're all connected and the access is freely available, we have a number of clients that will just push this data straight into the tractor through My John Deere. Now that's what we want to see, more of that, and in time we'll build more and more John Deere integration, where you'll be able to push these files directly from our platform into the tractor directly, so you won't even have to go through the My John Deere link. So, the world is getting better with data transfers and file formats, and collaborating better. So we're really excited about the future where everything's connected and we can push and pull data without having to go to the machine. Moving on to number 2, I guess, and we want to allow plenty of times for questions. We've got heaps of people on the call, so really want to have plenty of time for you to ask questions afterwards as well. Is our stack product, and like I said before, and Chris mentioned the same thing, is that we're looking now at long-term productivity, not just what's happening here and now, but let's look at long-term productivity. So we've built a little tool that stacks up to 6 years of data, because the imagery started in 2017, so we're up to the 6th year. You can shove as many of those as you like, or skip years if you like, but you pick the month that's most relevant, and often it's September for winter crop, and it'll take you through each year, and you pick the right image that you want. We leave that in your control, because Sometimes you might have flowering canola in there. Sometimes you might have a fallow paddock or whatever, or a crop you don't really want to include because you might have had a bad frost event or something. So you can skip through and choose the actual images you want, and it'll take one image from each year, and you'll see down the bottom there's 5 images lined up. So you can preview those, and once you click purchase, it will produce this. And this is just squashing all of those years into one. And so it works on a per field basis, and it automatically skips any fallow paddocks. So if you've had a fallow year, it would ignore that and move on to the next one. So you can do your whole farm at once, but it still outputs per field, because the reason we do that is that essentially when you work back into a controller, into a tractor or sprayer or whatever, those you'll be working on a field by field basis. We know in rice, for example, doing a lot of work in rice at the moment, where an aeroplane will fly across multiple fields at once because it's spreading fertiliser in rice. We understand that. That's a bit of a left use case. So left field. So most of the time when you're in a tractor or a sprayer, you're going to operate on a farm field basis. So we export this now at a per field basis. The good thing to see in an image like this is these are 2 fields together, and the zones go across fields. So it gives you confidence that that the thing's telling you the right information. So if you want this feature, we have to turn it on for you at the moment. In the new platform, it'll be completely available, but in the current platform, we just have to turn it on. The questions come, can you stack historical yield maps? Yes, in time we'll be able to do that, but we might be a little way away from that. We want to get yield data into our platform in the near future, and therefore we'll be offering stack for whatever layers you want to throw in your stack to combine that together. So not at the moment. We can do that manually for you if you want. We've done tons of it. It's a fantastic way of doing it if you've got good quality data. The good thing about satellite data is there's no humans involved, so generally it's got less errors, if that makes sense. So I think that's why we use satellite. But yeah, we love using yield maps as well, because it's really what is your final measure of performance. So just contact us through support@datafarming.com.au, and we'll turn that on for you, and you'll just receive an invoice from us as you use it at a per hectare charge. Chris, any comments on Stack? What do you think about it?
Look, I think for those guys that are working on vertisols in the north and might be stuck with the conundrum about deep placement and how do I know I need it and where I might need it, it's going to be a solution. And what you're going to talk about next, it follows on to that, because once we get into some of these deep placement and deep amelioration, then soil testing goes out the window as to knowing where we're up to for the future, because we've got such a diversity of variability we're introducing with deep placement that we can't actually properly sample with soil sampling. Then we're going to have to use other tools.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's key to understand what's driving this over the long term, so that you're actually fixing up, what you're meant to be fixing up, and not making assumptions, I guess.
Yes.
This particular farm, for example, we found that he had a particular, I think it was sulfur from memory. Now I can't remember, but yeah, these poor producing areas were shallower soils and were also deficient. So I think the thing here is, like all of our zone maps, even like we talked about before, do you apply more or less to those poor performing areas? And in this case, Chris, it's actually soil depth that's causing these lower productivities. So, it's like a lot of central Queensland. A lot of these maps are relating to soil depth. So they just haven't got the potential. So there's no good trying to spend a lot of money on something that's 50 centimetres deep and, it's never going to have the potential. We'll then start winding back rates on those areas. But if you look at the earlier zoning that we showed earlier, I mean, you might want to increase the rates on those poor performing areas, for example.
Yeah, one of the things that that becomes important with this sort of thing when we're talking about long term is these are features that are stable in the long term because that's what it's picking out. The other thing you could do this is throw the image against an elevation map. And that's a quick thing of saying, well, soil depth's probably going to be related in some way to elevation. So, you can start to do those sort of queries without getting out into the paddock necessarily and doing, what the early guys did and instead of playing tennis on the weekend, push probes in to see how deep the soil was.
Yep. That's good points. And depending on the cause of that, that constraint, it's really going to determine what you do with it. And that's why, again, soil testing and targeted testing is so very important. Thirdly, let's jump into Enriched Strips. This is some work we've been doing with Summit Fertilisers in Western Australia. Quite exciting work that we've been doing. And Enriched Strips aren't something new, right? Like the Europeans have been doing this for years, and there's been quite a number of trials done around the districts. But it's something, I guess, you can do in season. A lot of these things, once you plant the crop and you've done your starter up front, then you're pretty much locked in, aren't you? This is probably one of the few things we can start to vary, along with plant growth regulators. If you are in those high rainfall zones, then sure, applying a plant growth regulator based on biomass is a very good idea. And cotton, for example, picks in cotton is another great example of how you use biomass imagery. But when you're talking about in-crop nutrient management, there's really not much you can do except for maybe nitrogen. So I guess you can put these enriched strips, and we're talking maybe double the rate of normal application that you would see, or recommended rate. So we're trying to get the full up end of the response curve. Now, of course, at those rates, you've got to be very careful of things like seed burn if you're applying with the seed. And you can go and check your local guides for that in terms of row spacing, and the rates that you're using will determine how much potential risk you've got there. Chris, am I correct?
Yeah, the type of opener as well. So, yeah.
Yes, true. So if you've got a disc, you might be putting it all concentrated.
The third one is the soil texture group, whether it's a light, medium, or heavy texture, which relates to the moisture holding capacity at sowing.
Yep. And similarly, if you're applying this enriched strip after the seeding, then potential for leaf burn if you're using a sort of a liquid product in a high rate, Chris.
Yes, definitely.
And then I guess the next step then is about monitoring that strip in relation to the rest of the field around it. I should say, and I'll jump into this in a minute, but where you put your strip is really, really important. And I'll explain how this all ties together in a minute. And thanks, John, too, for joining us. Yes, high facility situations, zero strips are often more useful. Yes, and I was just about to add that. Thank you. Sometimes you want to get the full response curve. So a nil, a recommended rate, and a double rate, if it's allowable, is a perfect way to get to a feeling of how much money you've just made out of that nitrogen application. So spot on. Thank you, John. And John's a very big expert in high rainfall zone, high productive wheat growing down in Victoria. Once you've got those, you can extract the values, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then depending on the algorithm, Chris Dowling's got a lot of experience in this area as well. Got some great tools. The guys at Summit Fertilisers also use an algorithm where you put in the NDVI reading from the enriched strip, and you put the NDVI reading in from the rest of the field, and it will tell you what N rates to apply. Now, I guess big caution there again too is that depends on what the seasonal conditions are going to be like. There's no good applying large amounts of N in the season for it to burn up all the water and leave you with no grain, and that's a high risk. Chris, anything to say on that?
Yeah, well, double's a good place to start with, but you just got to be careful of the conditions that enriched strip has experienced prior to you actually making that assessment. Because if we end up with wet conditions like we have now, and you put it on pre-plant, then there's a possibility it could have denitrified, and there's a lot of, you can see the soil water levels in Northern Australia. Any enriched strip is probably not all that rich strip now, and there might be a need to reapply or do something over it to make sure it is truly enriched at the time that you want to actually assess what the crop requirement is.
Yep. Another comment, sometimes it might not be always practical, but if you apply your Enriched Strips across your row direction, that could eliminate some of the other variables. That's a good comment, Mossy. Thank you. In these cases, we've been running them with the run direction, but I agree, I've done that as well. The biggest thing you've got to watch when you do it across the run direction is when you've got a yield monitor in the field, you could have a 50-metre lag either end. So when you do that, make sure your strips are like 200 metres wide. Because you might have to wipe out the 100 metres either end of that. So again, just keep that in mind when you finally get through to the other end with yield monitoring. So we did some 10 fields in 2021, and what we did first, and this is very important, is to actually do your stack first or your zone maps first. So you're trying to get the responses across different zones of the field. So how do you do that? You either use farmer knowledge or agronomist knowledge. You already know where these areas are. You can look at it sometimes, like in WA, as this case, you can see it in the soil and just the soil colour. So it doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be representative of those areas. But this, you could use a yield map to do this. You could use the stacked product is an easy way of doing it. So what we did then is actually look at running our strips in the same direction. So we've you might not be able, hopefully you can see that, but the strip is running in the middle and then there's a buffer around it, and then that's the rest of the field. So we're running in the same direction. Like you said, Mossy, you could run it at right angles as well. I'll get to that question in a minute. Thanks, Alicia. Just give me 1 second. So yeah, we were running the strips with the run directions, and when you look on our platform down the bottom right-hand side, you can see the NDVI readings coming up. So the maximum, minimum, and the average. So in this case, this is the buffer. So we're just drawing them in as 3 separate sort of fields. And you can do this off another GIS program. We can help you do this, or you can do it yourself in the platform. So we've got a buffer strip, and then we've got the actual enriched strip. And you'll see that the rates, the NDVI readings are provided there. So you can actually get the average of the strip, the average of the buffer, and the average of the field if you want to look at that. It's good to have your buffer or your control strips close by so that you're not getting those other influences. And I've seen time and time again where people will come and put fertiliser strips in, and guess where they put them? Down in this high production area or in this low production area. But typically it's always in the high production area because they want it to look good. And that might not be your best responsiveness. Is that your best part of your field? Is that the best representation of that field? Do you want responses in just poor areas? And location of these trials is so critically important. And I've seen so many fertiliser trials put in with no consideration to the underlying variability, and it's completely screwed the results. Now, you would have seen the same thing, Chris, I guess.
Yeah, site selection in any experiment is paramount because, and it's got to align with the goals of what you're trying to get out of the experiment. So you've got to think in your mind very closely, what do I want to get out of this? Do I want to prove that the high yields can be areas that are there now can be made higher? Do I want to prove that I can get high yields out of the low areas? And your placement is in alignment with what you want to find out.
Spot on. Yep, spot on. One of the questions was, can we use predictive modelling with predictive weather, to help with these decisions? Absolutely. I think our sort of medium-term predictions are getting a lot better, but there's still a lot of rubber. Still a lot of extrapolation and possibility of seasonal conditions changing as it goes. But I think things are getting better in that regard, in that medium-term outlook. But you may or may not get it at that farm level as well. So, like everything in agriculture is driven by the weather, and it's certainly something that's still got a long way to go in terms of getting right. But I totally agree. There's no good going out and doing this, if the seasonal conditions aren't looking too favourable. So, it's absolutely critical to have those in mind as you go.
Tim, I think there's a comment. This is for nitrogen, but certainly for you want to know about the variability in this across seasons, and it's certainly very applicable if you're going to do this for phosphorus or potassium, and the long-term response for that. You want to know what it does in a dry year. You want to know what it does in the wettest year to be able to understand your response in planning those nutrients. Nitrogen's more seasonal.
And so, do you think that, what are you seeing in terms of the variability in the phosphate and potassium levels in, say, high and low zones? Do you see a lot of variability in nitrogen, phosphate, particularly? Potassium, phosphate and potassium.
Look, just out yesterday, talking to a group of farmers, they had Colwell peas, anything from less than 5 to 30, in an area that's been cultivated for whatever reason. The majority of phosphorus in the industry is approaching adequacy, and at some stage, our soil tests do not measure rundown very well. So P-rich strips are about rundown, not increasing yield.
Very good. And do you think that a zonal response to that is also going to be really important?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Because different PBIs and different factors will affect the rate of P rundown.
I think you might have had a high producing crop. I did some stacking of yield maps a while back, Chris, and we actually showed that there's parts of the field that were 20% high yielding every year, and there was other parts that were 20% lower yielding every year. And I said to the grower, after 5 years, that means you've grown one more crop at one end of the field and one less crop at the other end of the field, but you've applied fertilizer for the same, for that, for the middle ground, for the number of crops. So you're actually under fertilizing one area by one crop and over fertilizing an area by one. And so you're going to get this continual, extraction on those high producing areas. And all of a sudden that might become your yield limiting factor. Like you say, it's become run down. And you don't know what the responsiveness is. It could be responding better in your high zones, whereas I often see that nitrogen might be best responses in the low performing zones. So, I think that's absolutely spot on. Mossy talking about total P as well. Yes, it's important. Total phosphate. You want to make some comments on that, Chris? Not just available.
Total P will reflect it, but particularly in soils that are not very calcareous. So we have to divide them up. So in the calcareous soils and the vertisols in particular, the BSESP is the one that reacts most quickly. So we've got a range, because total P is such a big pool, it responds very slowly to small increments of rundown. The research in the north has said the BSES pool is the one that shows it. And there's long-term experiments that show that the Colwell P, despite 200 kilograms of P being removed, the Colwell P has stayed the same because it's being fed from this other pool, the BSES P, that is actually running down and showing the rundown. The total P hasn't changed. It's changed a little bit, but the BSES P has come down by about 40%. Total P's come down a couple of percent, and the Colwell P stayed the same. So Colwell P, we are recognising, is not a good tool to predict rundown.
There's also a question here about EM to help with this. Absolutely, EM's a great tool. We've got a number of units running around the country now, and EM's a great tool to actually to try and get that underlying soil difference and any other subsoil constraints as well, because it's not measuring it doesn't measure any nutrients. It measures salt, clay, and moisture content. So you've got to detangle what it's telling you, but more than often it's going to be a subsoil constraint that it's picking up. In a non-saline soil, it'll pick up certainly clay content, and that's going to be hugely different, Chris. In a dune swale system, phosphate rates or phosphate levels are going to be massively different between those heavy soils and the light soils on the ridges. Correct? That's
correct. Yes. Well, unless it's got a long history of very adequate P rates.
Yeah, which actually a lot of areas we're noticing in southern states have absolutely. they've been accumulating, like you say, phosphate for many years because they've almost been over fertilising, and we're seeing some quite large rates in some of those areas because the crop hasn't extracted enough.
Yeah.
We did an EM map the other day on a client, and we did some nitrogen sampling, Chris. I haven't told you about this, but where we had subsoil constraint, he had 1,000 kilos of N. This is dry land, non-irrigated, non-cotton, sort of 1,000 kilos of N, and where it was good soil type, no problems, it had almost zero, 20 kilos or whatever. It needed fertiliser. So that can show you, that's in one field, that shows you the variability. That's what subsoil constraints can do, is just start accumulating nutrients like that.
If your roots can't see it because they can't grow down there, it's too hostile. Well, once the nutrients get there, you've got to either ameliorate it if there is an option to do it, to get that back out, or you've got to write it off.
Mate, the questions are coming in quicker than I can answer them. P replacement, based solely on yield maps, is it good enough? And I've done plenty of that, and I reckon it's good. But what's your thoughts, Chris?
Sorry, which one was that?
Just doing P replacement on yield. So 3 kilos per tonne or whatever it is. I forget the calculation. Just doing a replacement plus a bit more.
No, it's not, because in a response curve, P replacement is okay when you're at about the critical level where you're not seeing a response. And I'll extend that, not seeing any response in any species that you grow in rotation. So, the target is to get the soil to a concentration where no species that you grow, and that we know there's variability across species in their tolerance of low P or their response to P. At that stage, yes, replacement is justified. But, if you had a soil that was low in P and applied the replacement rate,
yes,
then you're probably only going to generate 80% of the maximum yield.
Well,
the reason putting on a maintenance plus is going to get you closer to the 95 that you're after.
And keeping in mind that low production area could be because of low P. So putting a lot less P on is not going to solve your problem. So I guess it's backing it up with.
And the same goes with N, particularly this season. People seeing the price of N the way it is and saying, look, I'll just drop back and put maintenance on. That's okay for very low responsive areas. But by and large, looking at that water map and looking at what happened last season with very good yields, reasonably high proteins as well, that's not going to be good enough, and that could be costing you very large sums of money. Just say, I'll drop back to removal this year on N. It's not the right response.
Absolutely. I couldn't, totally agree. That's like we've seen 5-to-1 returns on investments from those higher licks of N as the season comes through, and it's like $5 made for $1 spent, mate. That's what it could cost you, eh?
That's right.
Questions still coming in. I mean, that question about P replacement, Chris, was assuming that the caveat was assuming there's been a good history of blanket rates applied. So I think we agreed with that, didn't we?
Yeah. Absolutely, yes.
I've got. Is there software to correlate the soil parameters with the zones? I guess that's still work in progress, and I think BackPaddock and ourselves are working on that, but we're a little way to go. But we're trying to make tools that will help you extract out those readings based on those zonal maps, so you can get those zonal responses, if you like. And we've done the same thing in these nitrogen rates. We've actually looked at the response in the high, medium, and low production areas, so you can see which one is responding more. So, good question though. So how many farmers who've used this tool in the past are altering the use of their rates this season? So we've done this for a couple of years with WA, and in every case, pretty much, well, not all cases, but the vast majority of these, they needed more N, and the N paid for itself. I did have some numbers, but we're actually running out of time. But I've got some numbers to show that. But so, I mean, being conservative, and you should be, is not over-fertilising with nitrogen, because you could run the risk of running a dry finish and running out of growing big biomass and no grain. But in all the cases, that pretty much all of them, in WA last 2 years, we've seen where there has been definitely a return on investment from those higher end rates. But that's the seasonal thing as well, Chris. But there's certainly, that's my seeing of it. There's definitely been responses in every year to more nitrogen.
Look, the best thing to do is just, particularly for where you're growing cereal crops, that's going to point to that's the protein, your protein outcome. So, for wheat under 11%, and then for barley under 10.5%, it's an indication you had more horsepower there, you had more water than you had nitrogen available to the crop. Now, taken up by the crop. You might have had it available, but the crop hasn't seen it, put it into the biomass, and then stacked it into the grain. Now, there's a lot of things going on there, and you need to look at the specific circumstance to figure out why that happened. But a low protein is saying that there was not enough in the biomass, because something like 70% of the at flowering, because 70% of the N that ends up in the grain in a season like last year probably came from the biomass. And given we had a long, slow, cool finish in most areas, up to 30% could have come from the soil post anthesis.
One question: what's the best way to generate a pea prescription map? Well, I guess we might cover that right at the end, Chris, about the zone to sample or sample to zone. Maybe we should cover that there. Is there any combining EM and biomass? Often we don't see that many correlations sometimes with EM and biomass because there's often other factors that play in the crop other than just soils, right? So it could be a waterlogging issue or a pest and disease or establishment issue from other reasons, so sometimes we don't see those correlations. Are we seeing other soil types with strong correlations? I guess, interestingly, like these Western Australian ones, I mean, the EM map would look pretty much the same as the stacked map, but one thing that strikes me, Chris, is that we do these zone maps and then we look at the yield and they always look the same, and it's like, the trends are there. Let's get in and keep managing this, and that means targeted sampling and a bit more digging deeper to find out what's causing that variability. But so often we see that these are long-term trends that just keep happening and happening, and we've got to really start thinking more zonally to manage that field differently. I don't know if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, look, it's about water availability. In the end, where something can get more water and destroy less water in the crop, either by weed competition or pests destroying the crop, or if we can eliminate those things and come down to where are parts of the field, wet or dry season, that generally provides more water, then we can be more. The problem is we've got this matrix of some things because of elevation or because of soil texture, they do better in wet seasons and worse in dry in dry seasons, and the reverse goes on. Understanding those is important as well, where we've got these dynamic sort of situations happening, because if everything else in the field is static, then we can manage that to be static, either high yield or low yield. It's the ones that flip depending on the moisture availability to be high or low yield that become the problematic ones, and then the ones we can focus on in making sure we cut back in the dry years when they don't produce, and do something better in a year where they're likely to produce more.
And that follows on Ian's said another comment. Good point. Past to recent N fertiliser applications that may be lost with waterlogging events and heavy clay soil, so you get that denitrification as you mentioned. So many recent tests coming back very low for mineralised N, where we knew it was higher. We saw that in the floods, Chris. Remember back in 2011, 2013, yes. We had whole profiles of 0 N, and they before that they had plenty of N. So, and they were getting, I think, denitrified from very deep in the profile.
They were. The Colonsay trial outside Toowoomba there had been measured in February prior to those floods, and at the end of it, they'd lost something like 60% of the N, and it was down as deep as 60 centimetres that had gone missing from. Now, classically, we'd think 0 to 30 is where most of it will go from, but under that flooding scenario, there was evidence, and it wasn't leaching because it was sampled so much deeper, and there wasn't any evidence of leaching, so it had to be denitrified down to 60 centimetres.
And that's, I mean, you've been in the research game for a lot of years, Chris. I mean, we never thought that was possible.
No. And look, having driven through that area again yesterday, and looking at the amount of water that's laying on paddocks, I don't doubt it's probably not going on again now.
Yeah. Whereas in, say, WA or maybe some parts of South Australia, you're more worried about leaching deep losses rather than not vertical up losses from denitrification.
Very much so, yes.
I haven't got much time left, I'm sorry, but one thing we're going to mention is, when you measure these strips, this is just one of the examples of where we did measure these higher end strips, and this is, again, this is just one example. Don't take this as gospel, but where we had a double rate here, it paid the highest amount even with the nitrogen cost taken out, but it met a different grade of wheat. So that's the other thing, like you said, Chris, is protein content. This was obviously clearly a nitrogen limited crop because of very low proteins, and we made it into another category, bumped up that protein rate, and it still paid for the N and still was the highest profit. So that might not work in all situations, and we're not recommending using double the rate of fertiliser. That, don't get us wrong, right? But it just shows that measuring those trial responses is really important. It's not exactly apples and oranges here, but you're comparing a bit of difference, but it just shows how you need to measure these responses, and yield is a perfect way of doing that. And you need to look for nitrogen in particular. Other things is yield and protein, not just yield. I'll jump over those. Chris, you had a great thing, and I'll just finish up with this. A great thing you said to me, are we zoning to sample or are we sampling to zone? And I've just tried to draw a little picture here to help understand that. We've talked a lot today about zoning to sample, but something like an EM map, you've actually taken lots of samples and you're trying to work out where the boundary line is. And I guess you could also put grid-based sampling. Chris, what's your comments on that? Because a lot of people are using grid-based sampling for phosphate, for example, at the moment.
Look, it's got to be well thought out of what you're trying to get at, and you've got to understand is when we're talking about sampling to zone, whether the soil variability is driving plant performance, or is the plant performance moderating soil variability. So, if you do a grid sample, there's nothing wrong with, through the data farming system of getting a map and having a look at it and saying, well, because a plant is an integrator of soil chemistry. It has tolerance limits that we know that, it just doesn't react to a 1% change in a soil test value. It has coping mechanisms. So just because we say that these two areas are different because the soil test said it was different, setting the boundaries of how far different it's got to be to get difference in plant response is very important when you're setting up your grid sampling and setting up your zones. So, you just don't pick whereas, the opposite is that for zoning to sample, you've got to understand what's causing the variability to know that you need to go and that you can zone and then go and sample to make sure. And it's zoning to sample saying, I know there's differences in these areas. I know that need to go and now confirm what it is.
Yep.
Sampling to zone, no, basically comes the other way, and it says, I know what's causing the difference. I'm going to go and measure a whole heap of soil chemistry and figure out that that's going to be what's causing the zones.
Beautiful. Thanks for everyone for joining us. We've had a fantastic response. I'm really excited and pleased that everyone could join today. And particularly thank you so much, Chris, for your fantastic insights and whatever it is, maybe it's 40 years, 30 years of experience plus. is incredibly powerful. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks to Summit Fertilisers for allowing us to use some of their data as well. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for the invite.